Busy. I kind of lost touch with a lot of the stuff that was going on here a little bit, but I think I'm trying to catch up a little bit.
You're probably up to speed, and if you want me to fill you in on any of the details, I totally will. So I think we are good to go and live streaming.
See? All I right. Kind of lost touch with a lot of the stuff that was.
Great, great. That was you on live stream, which I'm going to turn off now that I know it's working. Okay, so first things first, the reason that I had you on is because Gilbert PD came out last week with five other agencies, and they announced that the Gilbert Goons and one other gang are now officially classified as gangs in Gilbert.
Yes.
So that was not a huge surprise to people, but the thing that came after those words were, but we're not, it's not going to change any of the charges. And that is what has people just really, really confused. I'm confused. And so hopefully we can dive into a lot of those kind of detailed questions. Um, and there's a lot of them. So just starting there, does that seem strange to you, or does that make sense to you?
It both, I guess. I could see how many people are confused by kind of what's going on. It is odd to come out and say, so they're a gang, but like that doesn't really in the end mean anything or add anything to what's going on. It's a little bit confusing in that regard. So I understand the confusion people may have in regards to it. It gets kind of very specific, but also discretionary too.
And one of the thoughts I had was, why are the police saying this? Isn't it up to the prosecutors to determine the charges? But before I even move on from there, the same day Rachel Mitchell was giving a press conference, and she was asked about this, and what she said was, we put this in front of the grand jury and they came back with the charges they came back with. If they had wanted gang charges, it would have needed to have come from there. And that doesn't make any sense to me because they weren't even a gang at the time. So what does that mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't see Rachel Mitchell's press conference at all, but I kind of understand what you're saying about it. As a prosecutor, I presented many cases to a grand jury. Typically, what's done is an investigation is done, and then you go with your detective to the grand jury and you present whatever findings they have in their investigation to the grand jury. And the grand jury is the one that listens to the evidence, asks questions of the detective, or if they want to hear from other witnesses, they can request that. That usually doesn't happen, but they have the ability to do that. And at the end, the grand jury decides on their own what charges they want to indict somebody on. That becomes a grand jury indictment if they believe there's probable cause on whatever particular charges. Now, usually, as I said, the grand jury decides what the charges are at the end, but usually going into it, a prosecutor will usually give some type of introduction indicating, hey, look, we investigated these individuals, and these are some of the statutes that may be particularly relevant to this particular presentation you're going to hear. And here's at some point they say later on, here's a draft of an indictment that we have made. If you want to look at it, you're free to change it if you want, but here's a draft of something we've put together. If you want to just use this one, if you want to change it, let us know. We can change it. That happens sometimes too. But they're kind of steered in a particular direction usually. But at the end of the day, it is up to the grand jury. She's correct. It's up to the grand jury to decide what charges, what enhancements they want to do. But much of that is, it's not that simple. It's, what is presented to them, and what manner is presented to them can definitely shape their decision making. I mean, that's obvious.
I mean, mostly they're asked yes or no, right? The prosecutor says, here's what we'd like to do. And the grand jury says yes or no. And most of the time they say, sure, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's oversimplifying a little bit, but yeah, basically, do you believe these charges, evidence exists of these charges? And then they decide yes or no. Sometimes it gets a little bit more complicated than that, but basically, yeah.
And if the Gilbert Goons hadn't been designated as a gang at the time, then how could they have brought forth gang charges?
Now, that's a great question. The timing of things, if I understand, they were at least what I'm thinking of in my mind, that the individuals that were indicted on the homicide charges of, for example, of Preston Lord or whatever, that happened, a while ago. In this designation now, this press conference was just last week, I think, with the
Right.
with the police agencies, where they're saying now we're disclosing this is what we've decided about these guys. I don't know what's not clear from that press conference they gave is when did they determine that they had made that? When did they make that determination? Was it the day before they did the press conference, the week before? Had they determined that weeks or months prior during the course of their investigation? I don't know. I didn't watch the entirety of the press conference. I don't know if someone asked that question. Then when did you guys make this determination?
It was
The time.
asked and there was no response. They said that the investigation had taken 6 months and they had made the decision sometime in 2024.
Interesting. Yeah. So, yeah, if I mean, what you're asking is if they hadn't made that determination, or when was it made? If it wasn't ever made, it wouldn't be presented to the grand jury. The detective wouldn't go in there and say, "Oh, and by the way, we have designated these groups as criminal street gangs, and here's a charge that may or may not apply in this situation. Take a look at it." And that would open the door for the grand jurors to then ask questions. Okay, what evidence is there or not of them being a gang? Why do you think they're a gang? What evidence do you have of that? And what evidence is there that they were, promoting or assisting at some type of gang, So that would prompt those types of questions. But again, like you're saying, if that possibility was never there presented to them, I don't know why would they ever
Well,
ask about it?
is there anything that stops the prosecutor for adding additional charges after the grand jury has brought forth their initial charges?
No, no, nothing prevents them from doing that. It happens often. Not like it's a regular occurrence, but it's something they can simply do. They can, sometimes cases are indicted, more evidence comes to light later on, and they can go back and represent the whole case to the grand jury or to a new grand jury and add additional charges. So that happens all the time. So that's something that could happen.
During the press conference, they were explaining that simply being in a gang isn't illegal. If you are to be charged as a gang member, your crime must be in furtherance of the gang. And the example they gave is if a gang member is dealing drugs on the street corner, deals drugs, goes home, takes the money home, and does whatever they want with the money, didn't give the money to the gang, then that isn't in furtherance of the gang and they wouldn't be subject to gang charges. Okay, that was the example.
Right.
As far as we know, the Gilbert Goons, which were also designated a hybrid gang, don't necessarily have a formal structure. They don't necessarily pool resources. And I
Right.
don't know, are you required to pool resources economically to be a gang?
No, that's not something that's required for someone to be a gang, is pooling resources or for there to be some economic component to it. That's not a requirement under the law in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't, in fact, say that anywhere that there's an
Okay.
economic component to it.
So if the criminal purpose, because they do have to have a criminal purpose in order to be a gang, if the criminal purpose was, let's say, you know, getting drugs, using drugs, assaulting people, filming it, creating mayhem, intimidating people. Let's say that that was the criminal purpose. Then how could the crimes not be in furtherance of the gang?
That's the interesting part, or I think the thing that adds a lot of questions here is um the typical gang. When we hear a gang or think of a gang, right? You think of these traditional street gangs, if you're from California, you hear the Bloods and the Crips or things like that, right? Your traditional gangs that wear a color and they do things and they live in a certain neighborhood. That's what we think of. And those fit very easily within the definition under Arizona law of a gang. There's certain criteria, but the definition under Arizona law is very, very broad. It's intentionally broad, and that the person has to have like two of the following seven criteria, right? And it's an intentionally broad because if they define it too narrowly, then someone maybe falls just outside of that. And so they define it very broad so it can catch the people they want to catch, right? And I guess an example of this, if you want to think back to a few years ago, was the protests that were happening in downtown Phoenix, with was it like the BLM or the George Floyd protests, those types of things that were going on. And the county attorney's office at that time had charged protesters as a criminal street gang,
Right.
and said, nope, they meet this criteria. Technically, if you look at it, they meet it, and they had charged them that. They indicted him like that. Later on, I believe Rachel Mitchell came in and said, this shouldn't have been done. This isn't appropriate. I think those cases were ultimately dismissed. Those charges were dismissed against those people. But the point is it's broad, so it can get a lot of things. So taking that context here, when you go to the Gilbert Goons or whatever, the Jack Boy Mafia, I guess is the other one, right? Which I have teenage kids. So jacking someone is beating somebody up, right? So Jack Boy Mafia. It would seem like their intention or what their purpose is to go beat up people, jack people, beat them up, jack them up, rob them, those types of things based on their name of their gang. So the purpose of those gangs is a little bit different than your traditional ones. Their purpose may be, as you suggested, to just go around and cause mayhem, to beat people up, to film it, to build up their, notoriety and their fame within their little circles, their groups, and just to, cause all sorts of mayhem like that. So it doesn't fit in your traditional gang of, we do this to promote the gang and we take care of our hood. I think they talked about that in their presentation of like, this is very different. That's why they called it a quote unquote hybrid gang, which is not a legal term, by the way. Legally, it's you're a gang member, you're not a gang
Right.
member. They are criminal street gang members. They said that. So this term of hybrid means it's just not what we classically or traditionally call it, but it doesn't mean that that's not what it is. So it's just different, and in the sense that they're looking these guys out of the box. You could look at that one aspect of what does it say? To promote or further, let me get the exact language, to promote or further the criminal objectives of the criminal street gang seems to be the thing they were saying. They didn't meet that criteria.
Right.
Um, which is interesting for them to say that the police's job is to investigate a case, to go where the evidence leads them, and then present that evidence to a prosecutor who then decides what charges do they want to seek to go forward on, and then present that stuff to grand jury. It's not really the police's job to say, there is or isn't evidence of these things. Their job is just to collect evidence, not make the
Right.
ultimate determination. That's what was odd here. It's very unique for a law enforcement to get up and say, they meet this definition, but there is absolutely no evidence that they did something to promote or further the criminal objectives of the street gang. First of all, what are the objectives of that particular street gang? It doesn't take a lot of brain power to think about what were these kids doing. As I just suggested, they're out there causing mayhem, beating people up, robbing people, or just causing general localized, terror amongst the community. That seems to be their objective, right? So anything that furthers or promotes that seems to assist
It
that gang, right? So if it's the guy that's filming them to promote what they're doing, if it's the guy, and I say the word guy generically, if it's the guy that's selling them drugs so that they go out and do that, okay. If it's the guy that, I don't know, is buying alcohol for these kids because they're underage, it's fueling this, whatever. Those things, if they're doing that and it's promoting or furthering their objectives of just going out and terrorizing the community and beating people up randomly or whatever they're doing, I don't see how that doesn't fit in that. And it's odd for the police to come out and say, nope, it doesn't. I mean, it's when the police have come out and say that, it effectively, just stops it right then and there. I mean, I don't know, a defense attorney would have a field day now if they charge them with that, right? That's what I do now as a defense attorney. I'd have a field day if they charge my client with that, knowing the police chief and everyone else all came out and said this in a press conference. I mean, that just undercuts the whole premise of everything. That's what makes it so odd.
It does. It does. Okay, so I was going to walk through some different examples, not even related to Preston Lord, but I was thinking of Connor Jarnigan, who was at In and Out. Somebody was like, "Give me $20." He's like, "No." They hit him in the head with brass knuckles
Right.
as a big group of people. And it's hard to see how that could not be in furtherance of a gang. Like this was true. They were a group intentionally targeting somebody, to injure them and steal money.
Right. Right.
So,
It's again, like it's super broad to promote or further their objectives. What are their objectives? Right. I think that's again very common sense what their objectives are. It's not, again, it's not the traditional sense of a street gang that's earning money and then sending it into the prisons to support some prison gang or something. That's your traditional model. But like this is
right.
different. It requires thinking outside the box. But again, the statute's broad enough to where this, in my opinion, could fit in if they wanted it to.
Okay, so
Ultimately,
it's weird that the cops did this. You think it's strange. You think they shouldn't have. As a criminal defense attorney, you think A, it wasn't their call, and B, even if it was their call, they never should have said it. How did they say it? Who told them to say it?
that I like as I'm watching it, I'm just like, who is advising them on this is a good idea? Like to me, it it's more of the same, unfortunately, from those particular agencies. It was like they were always behind. They were always late to whatever was going on. They were late to investigate. They were late to take this seriously. They were very slow at doing what they were doing. And now it's like that they're getting this backlash. They're like, oh no, and now, by the way, no, it is a gang. We've determined it's a gang, but it's not happening. It's like they're always just a one step behind. In my personal opinion, it just looks like they're trying to cover their rear ends, right? Like they're in the hot seat and they're trying to show with all the work they've done, but at the same time, this is the odd part. Then they like cut their legs out from under them right away. That's the part of it I don't understand. I'm wondering like who's advising them on let's go forward and do this. And again, it's not just like one person advising these people. You're talking about multiple police agencies and statewide
Right.
agencies and task force. Like I don't know from a public perspective, like why they thought that was a good idea to go forward and do what they did.
Okay. All right. Um, I also okay, so some of the questions that have come in, one person asked, does the gang have to invoke their name during a crime for gang charges to be applied?
No, that's a good question. It's a solid question. No, they don't have to invoke, this is for the Gilbert Goons or something. No, it's not that. If that happens, great. It makes it easier for the police and for the prosecutors to go forward on that particular charge because it becomes very, very clear that's on behalf of the gang or in furtherance of them. They're promoting themselves. So that's like a super clear example of promotion. Again, there's lots of examples you could give. The example they gave at the press conference was here's an example of how it works traditionally, and we don't have that there. It's like, great, that's an example of how it works traditionally. That doesn't mean why isn't it working here, right? Like, why aren't we
Right.
critically looking at this more critically?
Okay. Okay, so another thing that came up was I believe Rachel said there are three different ways that gang charges can be relevant or applied. One was specific charges, one was enhancements. I don't remember what the third one is. Can you talk about the difference between sentencing enhancements and maybe it's charging enhancements and then different charges altogether? That's probably what it is.
Yeah, so it is a little bit confusing. So there is a specific statute that is a crime for participating in or assisting a criminal street gang. That's its
Mhm.
own statute. It's like a
Mhm.
statute like robbing someone's a crime or driving under the influence is a crime. Participating or assisting in a criminal street gang is a crime. That's ARS 132321. That in and of itself is a crime. Now it has a bunch of different subsections under it. And if you're participating in a street gang, it's a class 2. If you're assisting them, it's a class 3 felony. So it's different levels of crime involved there. That's an actual like charge that someone could be charged with. That in of itself is its own separate charge, separate from assaulting someone, separate from murdering someone or anything else. It's its own separate thing. So think of that way. Then on top of that, if someone is charged with that, they go to a trial, for example, and they are convicted by a jury of participating or assisting in a criminal street gang, they're guilty of that type of felony, a class 2 or class 3 felony. The question then becomes, what's the punishment for that? Prescribed by law, there's certain levels of punishment depending on the type of crime. There is an enhancement in Arizona, sentencing enhancement, we would call it, that enhances a sentence for someone convicted of this. That enhancement of that crime is something the jury has to find as well. So a trial often is done in a couple of parts. The first part of a trial, which we all think of when we think of trial, is the person guilty or not guilty of what they've been accused of? Depending on the type of case, if enhancements have been filed against the defendant by the prosecutor, sentencing enhancements, I should say, the jury's not told about those things ahead of time, because the first determination is, are they guilty or not guilty? Yes or no, basically. If the answer is no, then we don't move on to any sentencing enhancements. If the answer is yes, they're guilty, then the next step or the next thing for the jury to decide is, and the attorneys can present more evidence if they choose, or more arguments, and the jury is then told, okay, now that you've found this person guilty of participating in or assisting a criminal street gang, you now must determine if this sentencing enhancement applies, and if it does, then their sentence can be enhanced or increased, basically. But what's going on here, without getting into too much particulars, is if someone has this enhancement for, it says a person who is convicted of committing any felony offense with the intent to promote, further, or assist any criminal conduct by a criminal street gangs shall not be eligible for sentence suspension, probation, parole, or anything. In other words, it becomes an enhancement where the person cannot get probation. So if it's their very first felony offense, a nonviolent felony offense, so oftentimes people can get probation for those offenses. They're eligible to get probation. What this is saying is you're not eligible to get probation. You must go to prison.
Okay.
So it becomes an enhancement in that regard, that your sentence category changes. So there's two different things at play here.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
It certainly seems like it's going to have an impact, not so much on Preston Lord's murderers, because we've talked about this, like first degree is life in prison. So there's no enhancement to that.
Yeah. What are we enhancing there, right?
But there's a lot of other arrests that have occurred, and there have already been plea deals made for other arrests for people who are suspected to be involved with the Gilbert Goons. Kyler Renner was pulled over in March 2023 by Gilbert PD and charged with 3 different counts of dealing drugs, possession of large quantities with the intent to distribute. 3 different things of those. I don't remember all off the top of my head. He wasn't charged until February of this year, so 11 months later. And his bond was originally like 152,000 because he was charged with 9 counts, the drugs plus the assaults.
Okay.
But now it was reduced to like 17,000, and now he's out and there's a plea. If there had been gang charges, the plea could not have included probation. Is that right?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
If he was charged with some type of gang charge, again, it's just another charge he has on top of the drug sales or the other assault charges he has. I don't know his particular charges, but it's just another charge he has. When someone's offered a plea, again, I haven't seen his plea, so I can't speak to the specifics, but the concept of a plea is usually someone's charged with multiple offenses. Let's, for example, say 5 different offenses. In a plea agreement or a plea offer, oftentimes they are offered to plead guilty to maybe 1, 2, or 3 of those, and then they'll dismiss the other ones. So they're only pleading guilty to some of them. The state is agreeing to dismiss the other ones. That's part of the bargaining process of a plea agreement, is they plead to some, they dismiss others, and then what the penalties come from pleading guilty to those things can vary depending on the prosecutor's discretion. Again, they have sole discretion on if they offer a plea, and they have sole discretion on what that plea offer is that they extend. As defense attorneys, you ask for a plea usually in your cases, and then oftentimes you ask for, the best possible plea you can get for your client. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's that prosecutor that decides what it is and what are the punishments. So if he was, to go to your question, charged with gang things, would that mean his plea would be, prison automatically? Not necessarily. I mean, I don't know what he was offered. If his plea offer does say you got to go to prison as part of this, or if it says you're gonna get probation, I'm not really sure. I think he's the one, if I understand right, that he posted the bond, and so he's out on a bond.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, so that being out on bond just means you posted the bond and you're out. That doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the plea or what are your punishments associated with any particular plea agreement. His plea agreement could be to go to prison. And if he decides to accept it, he's going to have to go back into custody if he decides to accept that plea, as an
Got
example.
it.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you don't plead guilty to gang charges, then that rule about not getting probation wouldn't be relevant.
Say that one more time. Sorry.
Let's say you were charged with a bunch of things. One of them was this gang, being
Yes.
part of a street gang, but you don't plead guilty to that. You plead guilty to disorderly conduct or
Yeah.
simple assault. Then the enhancements of that crime that you didn't plead guilty to that would require no probation, that wouldn't be in effect, right?
Correct. And so that's how plea offers or plea agreements are negotiated, right? Hey, if I plead to this one, will you drop that one? And you may be asking them to drop that one because that one has harsher penalties, right? And so you want your client to plead to a lesser one. And so that's part of this negotiation process. Usually there's some back and forth between the defense team and the prosecutor's office about what resolution can they reach and things like that. So it's not automatic. If he's charged with that, he's going to get that. It's something that
Sure.
can be dropped as part of the plea negotiation process. Yes.
Okay. All right.
Usually I'll just say this little piece. It wasn't a question, but usually in a case where they're charging a gang charge, in my experience, the prosecutors usually want those people to plead to that gang charge. And they may dismiss other things. In my experience, they'll want them to plead to that particular one and dismiss other things. The reason why prosecutors usually want that is they want that documentation on their record that this person was doing something as part of a gang. That becomes part of their permanent record moving on, that they were convicted of doing something to further a gang, right? That creates a record. That's often what you see with these quote unquote traditional street gangs, as they're pleading to some type of charge like that because they're creating a record for them in the future, that there's no question in the future, were they part of a gang because they pled guilty to being part of a gang previously, right? So it's usually not something they would drop, to kind of look at that a little bit further.
Okay. Um, somebody said, okay, I've got questions from people. Do you think that the murder charge will stick for the person who was filming the beating of Preston Lord?
That is a great question. I don't have a crystal ball to tell you if it will stick or not. That is going to be one of the tougher cases for the prosecution. If it's not someone that was actually participating in the physical harm, that's tougher, right? At the end of the day, and the prosecutor's going to have to make a determination of how comfortable or how strong do they feel about that charge moving forward. If they feel strong about it, they won't resolve that. They'll go forward on that. And that may be a sticking point, right? In that case moving forward, if they don't feel super strong about their evidence on that one, they may offer a plea to something lesser or different, and maybe a lesser type of murder charge or something else to give that person a little bit better of a little lesser of a punishment, I should say, than maybe the ones that are actually doing the beating. So he may be charged with the same thing, but oftentimes you may see them get someone like that, a little bit better or a little bit lesser of a punishment, I should say, because they weren't the ones actually beating. So there's a way for them to, I say them, the prosecutor, to work around that. Whether or not it'll stick at the end of the day, I don't know that. That's all part of the work that's going on over the next year. This case is going to be going on or longer.
Next question is, what is the point of classifying the goons as a hybrid gang when they're not going to use it to charge the individuals?
Great question. Love that question. Like, again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Like, what's the point of having this press conference and coming out and saying this if at the end of the day, like, doesn't mean anything? You don't do anything. That's why I got my opinion was just like, they're just doing this to try to save some face a little bit. The law enforcement is. There's not really a point in doing it. And then you give it this other name of hybrid gang because it doesn't follow the traditional, like, again, that's not a legal thing. That's like something law enforcement has made up to call hybrid gang because, now it's 2024 and kids operate differently in 2024 than they did in the 1980s and 90s when you think of like your typical street gangs or whatever. So, why do it now? I don't know if it doesn't really serve any purpose for anything other than to, I don't know, make the community feel like law enforcement has done more work, I guess.
Somebody wants to know, how could the principal's stepson get away with that level of violence and no recourse?
I
And just to give you a
Yeah,
little background here, Rick Keener's son, Tristan, who was terrorized and beaten and then sent overseas because nobody would be arrested. Like the
right,
cops didn't do anything to his
right, right.
multitude of attackers who sat in class with him. So he identified one of these kids as somebody who had terrorized and attacked him, and the county attorney declined charges. And I think the question is, how could that happen?
This is what I don't know. I'm sorry. Did they decline charges, fully decline charges? Because that means something different than they didn't file charges.
I believe they told Rick that they declined charges. They were not moving forward with him.
Yeah, that's different. I mean, declining is basically saying we don't think there was a crime here that happened at all. Because the prosecutor, when a law enforcement submits something to them for charges, they have a lot of options. They can charge them, or not charge them, but not charge them has a bunch of different things. They could not charge them and say, we need more evidence. Can you go do this or that, collect more evidence, and then come back to us and let us know? We'll look at this again. But a decline is basically not that. It's saying we're not looking at this at all. So that's why I was asking you, was it an actual decline, which is very rare. Oftentimes, prosecutors will say, based on what I'm seeing, there's no reasonable likelihood of conviction, is what they say, because that's a charging standard for prosecutors. They have to believe that there's a reasonable likelihood of a conviction. If they don't believe that exists ethically, they can't and shouldn't charge someone with that. So oftentimes they'll use that language of there's no reasonable likelihood of conviction here, and so we're not moving forward now. Of course, if more evidence turns up later, that could come about. I mean, that's what this idea of a statute of limitations is. Charges could be brought forward later in the future. Now, there's a different statute of limitations for different types of crimes. Generally, for felonies, generally, it's about 7 years from when the crime happens or it comes to law enforcement's attention. So if more evidence comes to light later on, that could be brought back up. It could be, resurrected and brought back up later. That's why I said I need to see more information to know exactly if they're saying like we have all the evidence, we looked at everything, and this just is not a crime. Like that's something different. That may be if they're thinking or determining this was, mutual combat, I guess, or something. So there's no amount of more evidence they could bring in that would change their mind. But again, I'm all speculating about their reasons why they did what they did. I just don't know.
Somebody said, how do we know if these kids are in the Gilbert Goons gang or it's just random fighting kids?
Right. That's like a big question for me is, again, when you go back to your traditional street gangs, oftentimes you're talking about they're wearing certain colors or different things and they identify as I'm part of this. It's like very clear that's what they're doing. Are these just kids that are just going out there beating up kids because they quote unquote think it's cool, right? Or makes them popular amongst their friends, or with kids nowadays, their video goes viral and like that's a level of importance to them, right? So Is it just that, or is it a gang? In at the end of it, like if they are a gang or not a gang, doesn't matter. If they aren't qualified as that or designated that, what matters is, are they charged with, furthering the objectives of the gang? Like that's what actually matters, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Classifying them as a gang member is simply looking at Arizona statute that has definitions, and it says a criminal street gang member is, and it lists off certain things. And what the cops are saying is, we think they fit in these, they have two of these seven criteria. Great, but that doesn't mean anything without an actual charge that comes after it. So the question is it just kids beating up? Doesn't, I guess it doesn't matter unless there's a further charge that comes with it. Who cares what we call them?
Right. Um, can the Lords file civil lawsuits prior to the criminal court cases?
Yeah, they can file civil lawsuits for sure. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't advise them. I don't know, but
Right.
I would think they can and should probably file something. And it doesn't interfere with the criminal case necessarily. So that's something they can do, and it's independent. It's something different than the criminal case that's going on maybe at the same time.
Does the order of beatings, punches, kicks make a difference to the jury when they are asked to find the kids guilty of murder?
Is the order of the punches and kicks like who punched first, who punched second? Is that what they're asking?
Yes. So the Arizona Republic came out with a very long article where they said, based on our read of the police report, here's what we think happened. And they detailed, we think this kid did this first, then this kid did this, then this kid did this. And what they're asking is, does that matter? If one kid dealt the final blow or jumped on his head at the end, is that person going to be more guilty than the person who said, I just kicked him in the leg?
Yeah, it doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't really change it. So, because whether or not you're the one that started it in the middle or the one that quote unquote like finished it, you're all there for the same purpose and objective, and you're all equally under the law responsible for what the other ones are doing. Since that was your purpose, was to go beat them up, and then you're responsible for the natural and probable consequences of your conduct, right? The other scenario is, you and I, we go in to rob a bank together, and we're robbing that bank, and while we're in there, I accidentally shoot the teller, and we run out. And you're like, oh, that wasn't the plan, Mark. You weren't supposed to shoot. You're going to be just as responsible as I am. You knew our plan was to go in and rob that bank together. You knew I had a gun. You're responsible if I accidentally shoot the teller or intentionally shoot the teller. You're responsible for that in the same manner under the law.
Yeah. It's hard to wrap your mind around that. It's really hard to wrap your mind around the fact that the guy who filmed or kicked him in the leg and sort of like, didn't participate in what could have killed somebody is as responsible as the person who stomped the head or delivered the hammer punches.
Yeah.
Uh, and so will juries, how much discretion do they have? It's either yes or no.
Right. It's either a yes or a no. Again, I haven't looked at the particular indictments or the statutes with it, but I'm almost positive one of the statutes that will be included in that indictment is under accomplice liability under ARS 13. It's like 301 through 306 that talks about accomplices. And it basically says if you're an accomplice to someone, you're equally liable under the law for their conduct. And so a jury, I believe, if that's what's charged under that theory, they'd be given that jury instruction that says, even if person A didn't deliver the final blow as person D, person A is under the law equally responsible, legally speaking, as person D. So they're given that law, that jury instruction,
Mhm.
and then they just decide, yes, they are guilty, or no, they're not. That's kind of their options. Now, there may be questions of, if they're not guilty of that, are they guilty of some other type of offense and things like that? But that's going down the rabbit hole a bit.
Okay. Um, Somebody wrote in and said in the police report, several witnesses stated they were threatened by people in custody for murder. Would the possibility of a gang enhancement charge apply here?
I mean, potentially, right? That it goes back to that. We keep going back to these words of, to promote or further the objectives of the gang. Like, what are their objectives of that particular gang? If their objectives to cause harm and injure people and go on undetected, you'd probably say that, right? They don't want to be caught by police. Then part of intimidating witnesses and things like that is to not have consequences for their actions. That could be in furtherance of the gang. I mean, I don't when we talk about what are the objectives of the criminal objectives of a gang, even when police talk about these traditional versus hybrid gangs,
Mm-hmm.
like traditional gangs, like I don't know that they like write down these are our objectives, right? Like and write them
Right.
on a piece of paper and everyone pulls it out of their wallet and they're like, these are our 5 objectives of what we're trying to accomplish with this gang. Like it's just not that clear. It's like the objectives of the gang are what law enforcement believes they are based on their investigations. We believe this particular gang in this particular neighborhood over here on the west side of Phoenix, their objectives are to this and assert their dominance and that. Like it's what the police say it is based on their investigation. So that's why I don't understand here when we go to the East Valley instead of West Phoenix. Let's go to Gilbert, Chandler, Queen Creek. I don't know why police aren't able to determine the objectives of this particular gang. They're calling them a gang. What are their objectives? Why can't they determine that and call it something else besides economics? You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So yeah.
Next question. One of the 7 who were arrested for the murder is out on bail. At one point, he had requested a reduced bail, and there was talk because he's a type 1 diabetic that it was unsafe for him to be in prison and he needed a reduced bail. They haven't, he's out on bail.
Mhm.
If the bail was reduced from the 1 million, would that information have been made public? Or since we have not gotten any word about reducing the bail, does that mean it was at the $1 million and not reduced?
Yeah, I don't, so your question is it public if it was reduced or not?
Right. Would we know if the bail had been reduced?
It seemed like you could find out. I mean, anything that's going on in these cases, unless it involves, a minor, then it's a little bit more protected than it does involve an adult.
Mhm.
But if it's an adult, it's public information that's out there, so the public can find out. Did the judge grant, there's a motion that goes before a judge
And
to
then it was
reduce someone's.
withdrawn. So there was a motion, it was withdrawn. Then there was some closed chambers meeting. And then, like, within a few days, he was out. And so people are just wondering, does that mean it was reduced?
Yeah, if it was reduced, there would be like a formal court order
Okay.
reducing that. It's not like they would do it in the back chambers and
Yeah.
then like never put any paperwork. Like there would be an order that someone can find publicly that would show if it was in fact reduced or not, So
Got it.
I
Okay.
thought I had saw, at least in the news, that he had posted the 1 million, which would tell me like that it wasn't reduced. That's what
Okay.
I thought
I did see that it was posted, but I didn't see anything specific. All right. I'm gonna see if there's any other questions here. And I have one other question before I let you go.
Yeah,
I don't know if you've heard about Rachel Hansen. Have you heard about Rachel Hansen?
no,
Okay, all right. Well, unfortunately, she was a 19-year-old who 2 years ago was shot dead in her apartment in Gilbert at 2 o'clock in the morning, and her murder's unsolved.
okay.
Um, her mom is gonna come chat, but the Gilbert PD took, Rachel's phone and computer. Makes sense. At what point can the victims' families get this information if they want to do their own investigation?
That's a great question. It's been 2 years.
Right.
Wow. Yeah, are the police still saying it's an active investigation or is it sometimes the police will classify something as an active investigation or an inactive investigation, meaning they've exhausted what they have. They're not closing it because they want to see if there's more stuff that comes to light later on. But do we know that? Do you know the answer to that question?
Yes, they recently sent it to the silent witness program and said, we don't have anything. If we don't get anything, like it is what it is. So, but I don't know if they said, I know it's not closed, but I don't know if they're considering it active versus inactive. They have told the mom, we don't have anything.
And they've told the mom we won't release the phone to you.
Yes. So is that normal? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, that is a unique circumstance for sure. Because the reason I say it's unique, if there is a phone or an iPad or some, computer technology, police can get that, obviously, as they should, and look through it. And it's not real complicated to look through it. They can get a digital copy of everything that's in someone's cell phone. They, have a program, Celebrite program that they do, and they get a digital copy of everything that's on that phone, every photograph, every text message, every, web page they've gone to. They can get cell phone records through the cell phone companies. To me, it would seem like if you did that and got that, I don't really know why you would need to hang on to the phone, especially if it's the victim's phone. Oftentimes if it's a defendant or a criminal, right, they're hanging onto that phone because maybe it has evidence of other crimes or other things, or a crime was committed using that phone, they're not getting it back. But in this case, if it's the victim and they're looking for leads or something like that, and it's not going anywhere, nothing on that phone would really change. I do know law enforcement doesn't want to give that back out to people because they don't want to potentially lose evidence and later be blamed. Like, why would you give that back out to the mom later on down the road? And you shouldn't have. So it's a little bit of a tough situation to, do. I don't know if, the mom's able to ask for a copy of the the cell phone download that they did. Can she, if they want to keep the phone, could she get a copy of the Celebrite report, which is a digital copy of what's on that phone if you're using the phone for the example? They don't want to give the phone back. Could they give that back to her at least?
Sure.
And use their own private investigator to do whatever they want to do in that particular case. I mean, maybe
Sure.
that's an alternate way to try to get around things.
So you just have to ask, essentially.
Yeah, you have to ask and keep
Okay.
asking and probably
And keep
ask a
asking.
lot.
And then for victims like that, what what type of lawyer should they be getting? Is it an injury attorney?
It's it's hard. So, for example, our firm does injury, we do criminal defense, and so there's some overlap there. Like it could kind of fall under either of those categories because there's obviously a crime that's involved that's not solved. Not that we're defending the person that murdered
Right.
her or whatever else, but we do have a very good understanding. For example, we have a lot of former prosecutors here, so we have a very good understanding of like how that system works,
Mhm.
especially from the victim's perspective to give them guidance, but then also on the injury side of like if there in the future needs to be some type of lawsuit against somebody or someone or something for, wrongdoing in this particular case. So it kind of falls under either one of those kind of categories, if that makes sense.
Do victims of crime usually hire criminal defense lawyers if they want to have somebody in their court?
They can, and oftentimes we are hired to represent, victims in criminal cases. So that does happen. There are other attorneys out there that exclusively and only represent victims, right? That's all they do. So there are those attorneys as well. Like I said, I think it'd be better to get someone more well-rounded because there's potential um liabilities somewhere else on,
Definitely.
other situations.
Potential
So
wrongful death, and then there's
correct, correct.
navigating what
And so,
happens. Yeah.
yeah, if you just have a very specific like criminal victims attorney, like they're just advising you about that and that court process and helping you there, that's like a very narrow scope versus getting kind of a broader perspective on avenues for relief and things like that.
Well, we may be talking to you guys about that case because it's
That
it's an interesting one.
that does sound interesting for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much. Let me
Okay.
make sure there's no other questions here. We've got people watching online, but I think those are all the questions. So thank
All
you
right.
so much for your time as
Thank you.
always.
Yeah.